and welcome to this momentous occasion. We are looking at a very unusual election, at least in the history of Zimbabwe. And it's the title, What an Election. And we look forward to the panel's reflection on this matter. This evening will be, apart from general reflections on this unusual election, we will also be looking at the question of whether these elections are null and void. Already after a very hurried conclusion by the opposition, SAPES on Sunday, through Shamisa, that the elections were, the process was flawed, and therefore the election was not credible, and endorsing or agreeing with the observers, in particular the SADC Observer Missions report. This SAPES went on to say, even though the elections were flawed, not credible, they still won the election. And we had Shamisa saying he was going to form a government the following day. Well, they have since backed down on that and simply said that the election was flawed. There's a need for a new poll. ZANU-PF has remained firm. They believe they've won and they should form a government. And today, the Gazette has come out, gazetting Emerson Mnangagwa as the president. And all the MPs, both ZANU-PF and SAPES, have been gazetted as MPs. So we have attention already, even before the mission reports have been digested. We see on one side ZANU-PF rushing as they did in 2008, where Mugabe was sworn in at midnight before he left for Addis Ababa. And I'm just surprised that there was not a similar setup where Emerson would have been sworn in the last few days. Anyway, here we are. The third theme we want to look at is what is to be done, which is more important. We are posting a brief statement. I say we, SAPES Trust and the Platform for Concerned Citizens, we were proposing a transitional authority, transitional government, about which we believe that the eminent persons should be involved. Last but not least, we want to debate briefly what is a transitional government in the circumstances of Zimbabwe. But more important, is it possible, given the balance of forces, given the geopolitics in our region? Are we not being too ambitious? So these are some of the questions we have before us. To help us here, very eminent persons. First and foremost, we have the presidential candidate who never became a presidential candidate, Xavier Kasugwere. And secondly, we have Robert Chapman, a presidential candidate who dropped at the last minute, and you'll explain again why he did that. We would have had Valerio. She had agreed in the first instance, but then gave an apology. She couldn't join us. The idea was to have the three presidential candidates before us today. And of course, we have my contemporary, about whom I'm pretty pleased to know that he's just next door in Zambia. And I was just joking with him that I had lunch ready for him when he got to the until he got to the airport and told me that they were sending him back on the next plane. But thanks to technology, I'm able to see Stephen again, my old brother. Last but not least, we have Chipo Dendere, a young scholar at Wellesley College in the US, and a combatant in terms of ideas, debate. Indeed, should be the first speaker this evening. So, without much ado, Chipo, you start, and then after Chipo will be Robert. After Robert will be Xavier, and last but not least, we'll have Stephen, last but not least. So let's have Chipo, you start on the first question. What an election?
Thank you for having me, Professor Ibo Mandaza. I am Dr. Chipo Dendere, as he said, from Wellesley College. With regards to the first question of what is an election, I think political scientists, we are finding ourselves in a bit of a definition turmoil. The events in Zimbabwe and in Gabon presents big challenges, right? Is an election the most bare minimum test for democracy, that if a country is able to successfully hold an election, people show up, they vote, that means that this country has some level of democracy. And you say that you don't want us to focus so much on what went wrong. There've been many discussions on that. But it's also difficult to speak to the future of a transitional government or anything else if we don't understand why this recent election failed, right, at the basic tenets of being an election. An election is a process in which citizens should be able to show up at the ballots and choose their next leaders. This is considered the easiest way to participate in democracy. It's different from protests, it's different from writing letters. In a functioning, normal situation, people should be able to do this. But elections in the context of countries like Zimbabwe are quite complicated. Whether we start thinking about the voter registration process or we think about who gets to run in an election. I see we have Sylvia Kasukwere with us, who was the only presidential candidate who was unable to be on the ballot. Whether you agree with his politics or not, the fact that a Zimbabwean, we've never been told that somebody who's domiciled outside the country has been removed from participation of politics. What does that mean for the 2 to 4 million Zimbabweans that are outside the country? Does it mean that in the future, all of those people are now also disenfranchised from participating in election? What is an election when the majority of voters struggled to register to vote because they were hurdles along the way, right? Where the government would have the blitz, but that wasn't available, not just to rural voters, but also to urban voters. And then we come to the day of the election. Is it really an election if more than 70% of eligible voters in a particular district don't get their ballots? I mean, at the bare minimum, an election should have a ballot. We're not even talking about whether or not you can see what's on the ballot, whether one candidate looks like a chipmunk or not. There should still be a ballot, right? I'm thinking about elections under Kaunda where they would have a frog. And I see we have Zambian experts here, but they would have a frog as an option to choose from. Now, that was a very problematic election, but hey, at the bare minimum, they had a ballot. And so here we are talking about an election when those basic things were not met. There was no ballot for most people. And when the ballot showed up, the design of the ballot, the logos were off. In the African context, we know that for most voters, being able to recognize the logo is the most important, right? Whether it's the open palm, the finger, whatever it is. But then you get a ballot where those things are not clear or they are set up differently for different political parties. Okay, so you might say, well, you know, it's just a logo, it doesn't matter. But then ZAC tells people that we've run out of a ballot after 30 minutes or 45 minutes, we've run out of a ballot. But more importantly, can you say that you had an election if people are expected to vote at 2 a.m.? Who among the citizens is capable of showing up at 2 a.m.? Automatically, you've disenfranchised people with disabilities. To make it worse, there's no electricity in large parts of the country. So anybody who doesn't have, you know, our vision, it's difficult for them to participate, right? So I think, if the question is, did Zimbabwe have an election? The answer is it failed at having an election. The basic requirements of an election were not met. And I'll pause there so that others can come in.
Chipo, I'd like to ask you a follow-up question. Were the withholding of ballot papers in the high-density areas of Zimbabwe, where Harare alone, almost 2 million voters, was that deliberate or inadvertent?
Yeah, so the voters in Zimbabwe were just over 947,000, so a million. But it wasn't just in Harare, it's also in Bulawayo. I think it's systematic. I think I was reading somewhere that voters in rural parts, I think in Mashonaland, in Manicaland, we're being told, the reason why your ballots are delayed is because they're coming from Harare. And yet the voters in Harare don't have ballots. Only 23% of Hararians had been able to access a ballot, or at least 23% of polling stations had been able to access a ballot. And I say that to be clear that even in places where the ballot arrived on time, not all citizens were able to vote because of other issues. So then it becomes very clear, right, that the other party is very clear that the majority of the opposition supporters are in urban areas. But this isn't new. It goes back to 2005, where the Operation Mnambachina project was targeted in urban areas right before the election, where the base of the opposition was domiciled. So it's hard to say that this was a genuine mistake, especially because we know from available SADC reports that ZEC was asked 48 hours before, 52 hours before the election, do you have everything in order? And we saw videos of Justice Priscilla Chikumba saying, we've got everything. In fact, we have 500,000 extra ballots. And so then that tells us that somebody was manipulating the system. Someone chose to not deliver ballots in parts of Harare deliberately, right? That this was a deliberate act, because it would have been so simple to have those ballots delivered in Harare.
Yeah, but my next question is really, if this was not inadvertent, it was deliberate, systemic, as you call it, what would have been, I've seen you doing on Facebook and elsewhere, some number crunch. You've been liaising for weeks with others in the same field of number crunch. What would you say would have been the impact? You've already hinted that many would have not voted. What numbers would you attach to those who were disenfranchised?
Well, we're still working on the numbers, but that's about 300,000 voters who, 700,000 voters didn't participate. And according to the numbers, Nelson Chamisa lost by about 300,000 votes. So the population from Harare was it over 20%? So in total, 20% of voters not being able to participate is quite big. And that's also what I think Chisman and others have called the rig-proof margin, right? That the opposition needs to win with at least a 20% margin to avoid rigging.
But what is your reaction to the reports which we are receiving that in fact the alleged rigging was done more in the CCC strongholds? Namely,
it gels.
Namely, in Harare Central, 23 constituencies is precisely where the rigging was done, by allowing, in fact, where the CCC won the seats is precise figures. If you, for example, Chipo gets 30,000 votes, they will take 10,000 votes off Chipo, leave her to win, but attach those 10,000 to the presidential pool. Have you heard that?
Yeah, I've heard that, especially when we're looking at the numbers received by some of the other political candidates. I had a chance to look at a number of V11s from across the country. And while we were entering them, many of the other candidates were not getting even one or two votes. And so when the final tally says that somebody who has consistently received who has received 0 votes consistently. Now this person has 56,000 votes. ZAC would need to provide us with all of their V11s at the local level that they used to come up with this number. I was actually quite surprised that the male candidate who received 56,000 votes polled better than Elizabeth Varelio, who, across the board, she's not doing well, but she's picking up 1, she's picking up 2 here. So then for somebody who's consistently picking up zeros to have 56,000 votes ahead of her, suggests that there was some gentle massage, some vigorous massaging of the votes. But I even think those small numbers, they don't matter as much as the fact that 70% of constituencies in Harare did not have proper voting. It's difficult for us to say we know for sure how many people voted in Harare, because when people are voting between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m., how are we guaranteed that those numbers that are being counted are correct? And as you've already noted, part of the strategy is that Harare wins enough for parliamentary seats. So this is something I've been explaining to people a lot, because people are asking, well, if they won Harare West, for example, how is their rigging? Well, the electoral system in Zimbabwe is such that the majorities that you need for parliament are different from the total majorities that you need for the presidential election. So if there are 3 candidates in Harare West with 10 votes, right, that they can each get, if one candidate gets 3 votes, for parliament, the other candidates get 0-0, that person becomes the member of parliament. But then whoever gets the 10 votes for presidential, or the majority for presidential, that's the person who's going to get the most numbers. So yeah, I don't think it's surprising to anybody that urban areas where the opposition has most of their support would be the most disenfranchised.
Then my last question to you really is, how reliable is the claim that the opposition, Triple C in particular, had a backup support in terms of the kind of technology required to do, for example, parallel voter tabulation, to expose the rigging? As I made the reference to the press conference on Sunday, where Shamisa claimed to have the V11s, and since then there's been silence on that subject. How reliable, to what extent has the Triple C or those who were interested or committed to having this election transparent, able to record parallel records that can become an issue as in the next day or 2 before Mnangagwa is sworn in?
So the first challenge that I think people have to accept is that there isn't a single country in the world where tabulation should be done in 100% of the polling stations, right? We should be able to take a sample, which is what they've been able to do with the Mantler system and other. I'm not sure what, I haven't asked the opposition directly how many V11s they have. But if there are 2,000 votes in the country, we should be able to take 20 to 30% of the V11s and predict successfully who would win the election. The challenge in Zimbabwe is because the rigging is so extensive, but also because ZAC refuses to share information. Now the opposition is forced to acquire 100% of V11s, which is just virtually impossible. Right? They might acquire 80%, they might acquire 90%, but it would be very difficult for them, one, because money matters. So to be able to deploy, I think for every polling station, if my voting day memory is correct, in most urban polling stations, there would be, at least 6 tents, which means you need 6 people manning that particular polling station. Now you've got 6 people manning that polling station. These people have committed to work from 7 to 7 p.m. But now the ballots don't arrive until 5 p.m. So many of those people had left, right? So now we imagine that even though they were committed people to be polling agents based on the amounts that I've seen raised through independent organizations, based on efforts that were made to adopt polling stations, people would have been committed. But my assumption is that if you were committed from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., it's going to be very difficult to keep even I don't know, 60% of the polling agents there. Still, with the 80%, I believe this yesterday, someone from Pachedu said they had over 1,900, the data from more than 1,900 of the polling stations. That should be enough. And right now, what that data is telling them is that the numbers that have been attributed to Nelson Chamisa don't match the numbers that they have calculated. And like I said, I also went into their system a little bit to look at the V11s that are being entered. But honestly, I will tell you that it is very difficult. First of all, just the handwriting for most of them. I was skipping so many of them just because I couldn't read. If we're having somebody in Gwanda, for example, taking a picture that needs to be uploaded into a system that then gets verified somewhere else, it can be very difficult to do that. So I think the fixation on whether the opposition had all 2,000 V11s, like polling station V11s, I think that's misplaced. What we should be asking ourselves is, if we got hold of 80% of the V11s, the tallies from those V11s that are representative, right, of the nation. So you're getting a representative sample from Uzumba, you're getting a representative sample from Mutare, you're getting a representative sample from Lawe. That should gel with what ZAC has given us. But for whatever reason, ZAC is refusing to upload the data. If you go online, well, the ZAC website was down for a little bit, but if you go online, ZAC, which is obligated to the citizens, right? The obligation isn't on CCC to provide that. The obligation is on ZAC as the independent commissioner, that right now, any of us who are interested should go onto the ZAC website, download the V11s and do our own analysis. And that data is just not there. So but I think if the opposition has 80%, again, 80% should predict for us what ZAC is telling us is the truth. So I'm not, as somebody who works with statistics, I don't think we need 100% of the V11s. And I know that a lot of analysts, journalists, whatnot have been saying, well, Chamisa lied because they don't have 100%. No, they don't need 100%. They don't even need 80%. 30% of a good representative sample of V11s should give us data that matches what ZAC has told the world.
Thanks, Chipo. We'll let you rest for a while. David Chapman, what are your reflections on this election?
Oh, thank you very much. And,
especially with regard to the performance by ZAC. And I know you are an expert in number crunching, and you did make reference some time ago to the system you guys had put in place to be able to track the results as they came in. What are your reflections, David?
Thank you, Robert. Yes, thank you, Doc. I hope you're doing well. And,
Robert, sorry for renaming you. Sorry, my boy. I'm sorry.
No worries.
Robert Chapman.
It's good to see a lot of familiar faces. Dr. Chen, I think it's the first time interaction. I'm looking forward to hearing your feedback. Dr. Chipotendere, thank you very much. And Honorable Seva Kasukwere, my older brother, it is a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you, Doc, for having me. As we were going through the 4 questions, I was writing down several notes, and I'll give my quick reflection. Number one on the election. There was I hate to say that there was some predictability that we were going to be here, right? So you come out of 2018 election and with an alliance that was strong, some support from what some will consider the G40 in Zimbabwe. The election is very, very tight in 2018. And somehow we didn't really learn from that experience to be better prepared in 2023. Instead, we look in the 5-year time frame and we saw a split in opposition. We didn't see electoral reforms go in. We didn't see preparation to be sure that ZAC has got some level of accountability that's in place. And then we get to the delimitation report, where regardless of your view of Senator Douglas Manzora, at the time leader of the opposition in Parliament, put through the very thing I think we're going to talk about at the end, which was suspending the election because of the delimitation report, and being able to take have an interim government while we go back and put in reforms and in place, so we wouldn't be here post August 2023. And that was opposed by other opposition, unfortunately. to make sure that we had at least some ground level, some groundwork to get here. So my review of this is there was some inevitability that we were going to be here. The question is, do we have enough documentation, support, and was there enough preparation to present in front of different delegations and understanding how much power they may have to sway Zimbabwe to go back and redo its election? Do we have enough evidence to support that claim? If the answer is no, I think we're going to see the same thing we saw in 2018, which was a much closer and a much tighter election. So that's my observation there on this election process. Dr. Dendere provided great insight into the process of on the actual election day. The delay of ballots is intentional. The goal is there's already voter resignation, a voter apathy that exists on the ground. And I saw this during the campaign. Every time we went on the ground, it was a little bit challenging to get people to understand the political, to have real political dialogue, but more importantly, to take a stance on their own for their own benefit, because the idea for them was it's not going to, it's not going to change, nothing's going to happen. They had this huge resignation. So when you delay the ballots and people have already been waiting at a polling station, and some are getting them, I think it was Glenview was one that got them at 3 p.m. Our candidates at Dangamvura got them around 8 p.m. People have already left. They've gone home to feed their families. There was already resignation. And the ones that would stay were the ones either paid to stay, which will most likely be for the incumbent, not for the opposition, or they have received a reward to stay, so the vote would be impacted in that manner. So it was a delay tactic because there was already resignation in most people's hearts. And the moment that they saw the ballots were not coming out on time, people said, yep, it's exactly what we thought it was. And they leave and go home and feed their families, take care of their families. Dr. Dendere touched on a very important topic, which was, the protecting the vote was a very big one and being able to get the V11. Some were voting at 2 o'clock in the morning, casting the vote, and the votes were being counted. But if you are not taking care of those polling agents, they themselves also had to go home because most likely either had work or families they had to take care of as well. So it was intentional. So for me, a lot has been covered by Dr. Dendere. When it comes to the first question is, what was my review in the election? If we were to have a conversation, and Dr. Mandaza, you and I had this conversation at your offices when I said, we were not really prepared to go into this election. And the problem of misinformation that came from opposition saying we were prepared. I remember one saying, we are ready to have elections. That creates this where we are right now. And when Douglas Munzora put in front of Parliament to delay the elections, particularly around the delimitation report, and organizations like Pachedu and even organizations like ZESNI were calling and saying the polling, voters' roll was not prepared. And to hear another opposition say, no, we are prepared, created a problem here now. When we start crying wolf or crying over spilt milk, we have to go back and reflect and say, did we do the things that were necessary to prepare for this election? And the answer is no. We didn't really learn from 2018. So the question is, what happens now, which I believe is your number 3 question and number 4 question, is what happens now.
We'll come to that, Robert. For the time being, you are saying, one, the elections should not have been held because the conditions for a free, fair, and credible election were not there. Why do you think the CCC specifically insisted on going ahead of the election, notwithstanding all these anomalies? What's your reflection?
My reflection is, I cannot answer that one directly because I was not privy to the internal conversations, but it was disturbing for me to hear, particularly when we say, like, I'm going to use Douglas Munzora because that was probably the most blatant, and we can even look up dates on that. When he went in front of Parliament against the delimitation and said it was inaccurate, and then that needed to create a suspension at least for 2 years. So that way the delimitation report can be redone. He was opposed by opposition. He wasn't opposed by ZANU-PF. Now, keep in mind, the timing of his filing on this, which I thought was unique, was that he had filed this right after ZANU-PF had also held his primary. So there were a lot of disgruntled people that were sitting members of Parliament who were not going to be on the ballot. So there was favor to get that passed, to then have an interim government where a negotiation would have taken place and a suspension of 2 years. I believe even the Zimbabwe Churches Council had even talked about having a suspension of elections to make sure that the groundwork was set correctly. So I don't know what the internal dialogue would have been inside CCC to say we have this, that we should move forward with these elections. And I remember saying we are ready. We're only focused on the presidential. For me, it was a little surprising, particularly without the ability to have an alliance. In this election, there was no opposition alliance whatsoever. There was none. Everyone ran parallel paths. We tried to put an olive branch out to create an alliance, because if the result was stolen in 2018 with the level of that alliance, of the MDCA as an alliance as a whole in that environment, this one was going to be even more challenging if everyone was running their own individual paths. And Dr. Dinder is correct in looking at some of the results in opposition. To see one candidate, to be honest, I'd not even seen on the road. I'd not met with them on any campaign trail, and they got 56,000 votes. It's very questionable, and how they would get that against other opposition party leaders that had been campaigning that got much fewer. So I don't know what the thought process is. I will say this firmly, and I've said this before. My greatest concern in Zimbabwe and in our political dialogue is that the opposition becomes comfortable being opposition and continually hold that mandate, and somehow the benefit continues to stay the same way it is, which is this two system that's inside. The inability to put in reforms, and the ability, which was odd in this election, which I'll talk about number 2 later, was the level of misinformation and the increase in polarization, particularly within opposition, was stemmed by opposition in this election. Now, we can talk about other entities, which I'll talk about those later. But for me, hearing an opposition say, we are ready to go to elections, when another one is saying there is a serious problem with this report and organizations are coming out pre-election, and to hear the leader come out and say, no, we're ready for elections, for me, it was very disturbing. So I don't know how they got there, but I sensed that we would be right here where we are with the contested election, which is unfortunate for our country.
Thanks, Robert. Xavier, Queensman, how are you?
Hey, Madala, how are you?
I'm okay. What an election. Tell us your reflections.
There was no election.
Both Chipo and Robert have indicate the elections were shambolic. What's your reflection from across the border, down across the Limpopo?
No, thank you very much, Dr. Mandaza, and all the esteemed panelists who are on this panel today. Yes, indeed, I think I share the observations made by my 2 esteemed colleagues, Robert and Chipo. I don't want to go back into what they have said, but clearly we didn't have an election. We had this election. We had something that looks like a predetermined selection process of what should happen. Why do I say that? I start off from, which again Robert has put correctly, the delimitation process and the splitting of the commission itself. You had the ZAC 7 commissioners writing letters to say we can't go along with other commissioners, and nothing is done. And immediately, then somehow along the lines, whether they've resigned or they're staying in, nobody knows. And Parliament didn't go into this matter to understand exactly what was it that was happening in ZEC, which was pushing these parties, the composition of the team, to start this internal wrangling amongst themselves. Then you come to the question of the delimitation process itself, which was challenged by Douglas Monzora. He even took it to court. And this is where the judiciary becomes also complicit. It's still sitting in the Constitutional Court as it stands. Nothing has been done about it. I don't know what happened there, but the application, I think, is somewhere in between the judiciary, but nothing has been concluded. In other words, he has not been heard. Now, immediately after that, ZANU-PF also goes on to start choosing its own candidates across the country, and all the other parties start also working around what should be done. But I come in, put my papers in terms of the ZAC and in terms of the Electoral Act, and we all know what happened, how ZANU-PF has to contest another candidate who already has been accepted, and we are now going to be removed by a court which has no jurisdiction in terms of the Electoral Act. That's for another day. But it shows you again that the whole process was done not because this is what the law said, but this is what the president of the country wanted. Who he didn't want, who must stand against him. This was decided by Emerson directly. I mean, I said this with a very clear knowledge of what was happening behind the scenes. Now, once you have such a political process interfering with a Chapter 12 institution like ZAC, and let alone with the judiciary, and you also get the Chief Justice himself getting involved directly, speaking about it, writing letters, stopping processes where you try to contest. He already made up his mind that this is what is going to happen. Now, once we got there, I had a feeling that this process was completely going to be a waste of time, because the choices that were being made by the leadership, who they wanted to be in place, is what was going to emerge. And the numbers that were being bandied around then, the 52%, this is not a new number. We have this number before, and it is the number that comes out. But interestingly, this number is not supported by any figures. In fact, it was very scandalous the other day to see that the total number of voters or votes cast, or the percentage that were then given to others benevolently, totaled 106. How do you get 106% where you should be having 100%? Then come the voters' roll. Why deny people the voters' roll? Yes, the argument that no, it's always at the ward. It's a ward-based process. Yes, but the voters' roll should be available at the ward, and let the people be able to check their names. You go further. Then come the voting day itself. What we get? An area in Binga has papers, everything starts at 7. But in Harare, you're going to start at 10 p.m. Already people have left. Now, documents are, if you total all this stuff up, we are the ones who invited observers. It is Emerson Mnangagwa who invited the EU, the SADC, all these countries. You have asked them to come and observe a process, and they make a decision. In fact, they make an observation, and they write their report. They say, this election, yes, peaceful, but does not meet the standards of a credible election. There are 3 areas. It must be free, fair, and credible. And again, you have to assess before, during, and after. So it's quite clear that during the day of voting, yes, there is peace, but that peace again is further marred by the activities, unfortunately, of FAZ. And who is FAZ in terms of the political system? If it was the ZANU-PF Youth League, I would have understood. But this is now a fusion of state entities, some funded by business persons for their own interests. It becomes quite a convoluted situation. So to me, in short, documents, we didn't have an election, honestly speaking. And it is unfortunate because the whole world was looking forward to a free and fair and credible election, for us to continue our re-engagement processes, for the whole world to start engaging Zimbabwe. This was so central. And I remember Dr. Comrade Zuma speaking in Victoria Falls and saying, Zimbabwe cannot afford another contested election. I think that was a mouthful. And I've also been reading the statements by Emerson Mnangagwa when he spoke at the donor conference when we were discussing about the funding. The Sina was there, President Son was there. He spoke about the need for credible elections. So, but what we're having now today is a slap on our face. It's an embarrassment. It's an indictment. Are we able to run elections on our own? No, we failed. Hence, there is a clarion call therefore that we need an election that is supported and monitored by our own institutions, so that the AU. And once we have been certified, it allows Zimbabwe to get out of this sticky situation. We can't continue in this situation. Yes, we can be arrogant. We can go in and swear ourselves and say I'm the president. You move around with the motorbikes and so forth. But for as long as you don't have the recognition and the respect that you are a legitimate leader, that stigma will always stick with you.
No, you were an insider for many years. Is it Legion? Is it a practice since 2000 that ZANU-PF and the state rig elections? And if so, how did they rig in the past?
You know, Doc, that's a very, very interesting question. We had elections in 2000, and those elections were very close. If you recall, we just barely made it in 2000, but albeit it was accompanied by a lot of violence and intimidation. That is a fact. But come the polling, the people did vote, and the free will of the people was shown. And again, just track back a bit to the referendum. You recall ZANU-PF lost the government position on the referendum, which you were a member of you were secretary for the Constitutional Commission. It did not succeed because people voted. And when it comes to counting, normally those presiding officers, the teachers and so forth, they do a good piece of work. That I think I have to give it to them. And then 2002, we had the presidential elections, won by President Mugabe. Again, there were quite a lot of instances and incidents of violence, but the counting reflected nearly what had happened. 2005, ZANU was very strong at that point in time, and we won. And the votes, obviously, there were some instances of a noise here and there, but it was not as much as what had happened in 2000. Now come 2008. Again, ZANU-PF did not win. We lost the parliamentary elections. We were about 99 votes, 99 seats, if I'm not mistaken. MDC had 100, and the other team had 12. So it was 98, 100, and 12. Make it, I think, then it was about 200, if I'm not mistaken. They're about numbers. Then you come to 2000, so 2008, even President Mugabe loses the election. The numbers were counted. I mean, it was clear. When it comes to counting, that you can't fault the people who do the numbers, especially at that point in time. And I'm talking about then, I think the ZEC had not come into the fold then. Then come 2013, substantially. It was done, I think even as a party, we done our homework. It came out right. But after the coup, after the 2017 coup, then you now see a different ball game. The stealing becomes very, very, very open. Why do I say that? The party has a super majority. The party achieves 2/3, but the presidential candidate struggles to go past the 50.1%. So he gets 50.4%. And those who know, just like what had happened with President Mugabe in Changirai, Mugabe had lost because at that point in time, his standing in the party was being questioned and the numbers were not good. But in this case, Emerson, and even in spite of the fact that he had just carried out the coup, he still did not manage to go beyond the 50%. The stealing is clear. It's now exact. I don't have to say anything that can be used against me, but I can tell you the way Chigumba is running, the numbers, when it comes to count, Chigumba doesn't count straight, because just now she can't tell us that 106% is the total number. And that other candidate who got 58,000, this is an allocation. Madugu got some 6,000, Valerio got something. It was now allocations. Not that this is what is there. Let's see their V11s. I hope somebody will show us. But the stealing is basically when they start now playing around with the numbers. And obviously the intimidation that would have happened before and so forth, especially in the rural areas, there's massive intimidation.
No, thanks, Xavier. I'll come back to you. Professor Chan, Stephen, your reflections as one who has been here since we first met at 1980. You have witnessed Zimbabwean elections. How would you characterize this one, even if you're denied access to the election the last minute?
Well, from what I can see, neighboring Zambia, This has been the worst election Zimbabwe has ever had. The worst organized, great ineptitude, a great lack of credibility. Now, I've been to almost all Zimbabwe elections since 1980, including the independence elections, which I observed officially as a member of the Commonwealth Observer Group, but I've also been present at elections throughout Africa, from Sudan in the north right down to South Africa, our southern neighbor. And of all of the elections I've seen, not only in Zimbabwe, but in Africa, over many, many years, this has been absolutely the worst. Just in terms of organizational capacity, just in terms of ineptitude, there's no credibility. All of the things that our colleagues tonight have been talking about, the lack of a voter's roll being made available, the terrifyingly late opening of polling stations because of the lack of ballot papers, all of those things speak to a lack of credibility in the final result. And of course, what you had was a great lack of facilitation of democracy. If you're really interested in democracy, then candidates should be allowed to stand. That's part of democracy. So Xavier should have been able to have his candidacy accepted. There shouldn't have been the need for Monzora to pull out all of his candidates. The scandal of trying to disenfranchise the 12 candidates for the Triple C and Bulawayo, all of these things were naked efforts to reduce opposition. But if you try to reduce opposition, what that means is you're not really having an election, you're not having a democracy. And then if you start refusing entry or deporting people who simply want to see what's happening, people like Chris Maroleng, people like myself, it raises the whole question to the international community, what's going on? What are you afraid of? So in no way can I say that these were good elections. They were peaceful on the day, relatively peaceful. There's no credibility, but the way that the campaigns were discouraged, police banning, rallies, all kinds of inhibitions put in through the courts. It was not a free election. It was not a fair election, not a credible election. So I agree with Nevers Mumba of the SADC Observer Group, and also with the observer groups from other parts of Africa and the world in general. This is a seriously flawed election with no credibility that can be attached to it whatsoever.
So Stephen, do you identify any differences, if any, between the various reports, observer mission reports? I've seen your tweet where you made the point that there's largely unanimity in terms of declaring the election flawed and therefore not credible. They came short of saying null and void, which is my next question after you answered my first.
Observer groups would not say that. In no circumstances do observer groups actually go that whole distance to say it was null and void. It's for the governments to whom they report to make decisions based on the observer reports. But for almost every single observer group to be so highly critical, that's a signal to the world out there, to the governments who sent them, that this is something which is very, very difficult to respect. So I think that what we were saying earlier, when President Mnangagwa walks into a room of his peers, they're going to be sideways glances. You're not legitimate. You didn't win this freely and fairly. You stole this. So it leaves Zimbabwe and the president with an international reputation which is seriously flawed in itself. Now, in the way of international relations, people are going to swallow hard, and they're going to recognize the fact that Mnangagwa is still the president, ZANU-PF still controls the country, but there will always be this shadow of disdain for how this thing was conducted. And even by Zimbabwean standards, as I said, and I've seen so many elections in this country, this was a new low. It's very, very difficult to think of how it could get very much lower. So there are big question marks to be asked about the strategists in ZANU-PF. Did they, as it were, go over the top, or did they go far, far too deep into the dirt? You can ask these questions. Certainly, it was not a good election, and there's no way it can be justified by the ruling party as in any way approaching a good election.
Now, going back to the observer missions, and you made reference to the governments who send them. How are you, given your experience in observer missions, not only in Zimbabwe but elsewhere? How do you see the trajectory between the preliminary reports, the final reports, and the decision of the governments concerned?
The final reports will reflect the basic impulses, the basic, as it were, findings of the preliminary report. They can't contradict themselves. So it'll be a longer report, the final report. It will try to say all kinds of things about how to make it better in the future. But even then, it's going to stop short of saying that the election should be declared null and void. As I say, that would generally be something that the sponsoring government or governments would decide upon. And diplomatically, that would be too difficult in terms of the international relations of Africa. So we're back to square one, where you have a flawed election, a flawed government that does not enjoy full recognition as a legitimate government, business as usual, but with a sideways glance at all times about why can't the Zimbabweans get their act together. In other words, the respect that has been lost by the country, that grows election by election. And this is something you can't afford. Certainly you can't afford this in international debt negotiations. Who are we dealing with? Not going to go down very well in terms of American sanctions, which is the last remaining significant sanctions. Nothing is going to happen for the betterment of the country. So for the sake of holding on to power in a very grubby way, when perhaps you could have held on to it in a much cleaner way, perhaps, that's a big question, I doubt it. What it means is that for the sake of a grubby election, you've sacrificed all kinds of benefits for the people of Zimbabwe. Things will not get better. Things will likely get very, very worse. And there'll be ordinary people who suffer in Zimbabwe.
Now, Stephen, you said that it's going to be too far-fetched for governments to conclude that the elections are null and void. The CCC, on the second bite, have declared that the elections are null and void. How sustainable is that in the context of Zimbabwean politics?
As I said, internationally, it's not going to have very, very much effect because diplomacy and international relations must go on. A RAU Policy will take effect there. In terms of Zimbabwe, internally in Zimbabwe, the CCC could declare the elections null and void. But already, as we've heard our other panelists say, members of parliament, the president, have all been gazetted. Basically, there's been a great deal of speed to make sure that business as usual with ZANU-PF in charge will continue. So the tactics and the strategies open to the opposition are at this stage very limited. I myself wouldn't be quite as hasty as the opposition seems to be, but develop a longer term strategy. But it's going to be 5 years of CCC being in the wilderness once again. Opposition unity is going to become very, very important. And above all, and I've said this before, I think I said this time last year and got into a lot of trouble for saying it, the opposition has got to present itself as a government in waiting. And that hasn't come across. In other words, if you're going to replace the government, what is your government in waiting? What does that look like? So I think that the CCC, in concert with other opposition leaders and opposition parties, needs to do a fundamental rethink of its strategy. And ZANU-PF really should not be too proud of its strategy because it's lost, as I said, a lot of respect for the country and a very great question mark raised over the legitimacy of the government of Zimbabwe.
Yes, you've led us to the next question. What is to be done? You've answered partly with respect to CCC, but there's a legal and constitutional conundrum because, as you said, and as all agreed, these elections really are messy. They're the worst ever. One would not be reluctant or hesitant to call them null and void. But as you indicated very clearly, that there are practicalities which diplomacy and the relative part does not allow one to say null and void. What, in your view, as a fervent observer of the Zimbabwean scene, what is to be done now, of which this webinar is part?
Basically, the SAPES position of the desirability of some kind of transitional authority, that makes a very great deal of sense, although again, in terms of the realpolitik of this country, it's unlikely to come about. I think what you might find some of the mediation efforts by SADC countries is talk of a SADC group of elders intervening, what the South Africans might be thinking about, what former President Chizano of Mozambique might be thinking about, is in fact some kind of coalition government, which might have the window dressing of something like a transitional authority. It won't be called that, but the CCC has already rejected the possibility of government of national unity, of a coalition government. And ZANU-PF's current moment of triumph, this current moment of crowing over victory, is unlikely, even if they were pushed, to form or offer a coalition government, very unlikely to offer anything but junior positions to members of the opposition. So I think we're going to be faced with 5 years of government and opposition, rather than anything that takes us beyond the current impasse. It's going to be, as it were, business as usual, which means, as I said before, very bad business for Zimbabwe in the world of international relations and the world of international economic transactions.
Thanks, Stephen. We'll get back to you. Chipo, what is to be done?
Hi. So what is to be done? I think the pre-election conditions for the opposition are very different from the post-election conditions. So Professor Chan said that, and a number of people have pointed this, that the CCC was not open to a GNU-like arrangement before the election, which makes sense, right? You are trying to encourage people to go out and vote. You want people to support your candidacy. So it would have been not wise, I think, for the opposition to go into an election saying, but we want a government of national unity. A number of things have happened. Clearly, international observers have noted that this election was very far from free and fair. We've had, I was chuckling a little bit when Xavier said that the stealing is now more open as opposed to back when it was in the closet. So now with this more open stealing, it's clear that Zach failed. Zach just now was tweeting very petty responses to people saying, you know, we're not obligated to show you the V11s. I think that's something that the opposition can take to court, not because they are taking them to court because they think that they will be given the presidency, but because even authoritarian regimes love the sense of legitimacy. So that is a very different case from 2018, where many of us didn't quite know a lot about V11s, but now we do, and there are clear things to take Zach to court for. Number one, the opposition says and taking Zach to court is not just about this election, but it's also about future elections. It's about making firm, clear standards on when ballots should be available, about when and who should have access to the ballot specimen before the election. So I think that's really critical, and that option should not be off the table. Again, keeping in mind that you're not going to court simply because you think Nelson Chamisa will be declared president, but in the court is the only opportunity for all of these things that we've been talking about to be brought into evidence for Zimbabweans to see, for the world to see. And even if the judges say we're throwing this out, that evidence has been put on record. And Zach will have to be forced to release the data that they're using for this election. So I think that's a critical way forward. You know, the world is watching what's happened in Gabon. You know, we've seen a number of African leaders making changes in their military this week. What happened in Gabon might not happen in Zimbabwe, but it doesn't mean that Zimbabweans will not protest. I think a lot of this conversation is sort of, well, what is the opposition going to do? It's also, what are the citizens going to do? You push people far enough, and maybe people will show up in the streets. We've seen that happen across the continent, because the conditions in Zimbabwe right now are not ideal, right? The conditions are not ideal. It's very expensive. People are living in poverty. I saw a report today that's saying that Zimbabwe is looking at another outbreak of cholera. Nobody wants another cholera outbreak in the country. So given all of this, right, there is an option, again, for the opposition to force ZANU-PF to a negotiating table, because even ZANU-PF doesn't want to govern in a nation of unrest, regardless of what Nick Mangwana is tweeting about how many toilets the president is going to open the next day. They don't want to govern a people that are frustrated, a people where, you know, in Tunisia, people forget this, that the protests in Tunisia were ignited when an individual was a vendor lit himself on fire. The things are so bad in Zimbabwe that I can see individuals lighting themselves on fire. There are a number of reports of people committing suicide because of how difficult the economic conditions in Zimbabwe are. So even that government does not want to govern when things are so tense. So I think now the opposition is in a better place to go to the negotiating table and to push for better, right? They have lessons from the GNU. They should demand in a very public way. Look, the world is watching Gabon. This is, I think, the 6th country in Africa to have a coup. The region of SADC is exhausted of Zimbabwe. I'm staying in South Africa for the year. And the refrain I hear most from South Africans is, why aren't you guys fixing your country? Nobody wants other episodes of xenophobia. And unless the situation in Zimbabwe is resolved, you know, we are looking at that. Things are not good for Zimbabweans that live in South Africa and don't have incredible jobs, you know, that are not in the middle class. And many Zimbabweans living in South Africa are not in the middle class. It's not, and the numbers of people flowing into the border in South Africa are just going to increase. So Cyril Ramaphosa, regardless of the congratulations that he's given, he's got a crisis at home that he must deal with. People in South Africa are frustrated with the economy, and those frustrations will be taken out on the opposition. Zambia is doing relatively better than Zimbabwe. Malawi is doing relatively better than Zimbabwe. Regions are getting exhausted of despots. So if the opposition goes to the table today, that's very different than asking them to do that 8 months ago before the election. Again, we wouldn't have had this evidence. And I know people keep commenting, well, why do you go to the courts? You go to the courts not because you think Justice Malaba is going to vote in your favor. You go to the court because you've got a week of presenting your evidence to Zimbabweans, to the world. Documentation is important. And I know in Zimbabwe, sometimes we don't want to document things, but we need clear documentation of what happened on election day. I mean, we're hearing stories here and there, but we need evidence. This morning I was on a panel where somebody told us that an election agent left a child at home and they were, working for 12 hours. By the time they returned home, that small child had been murdered. I'm not saying that they were murdered because of the election, but I'm saying if you're having your polling agents working for 12 hours, how many more cases of terrible things happened in people's families because the election was not concluded on time? This is evidence that you bring to the courts. ZAC needs to be humiliated in the courts, because right now the attitude that ZAC has online is the attitude of, we are above Zimbabweans. That's what they're telling us. They're telling us we're above you. We don't have to listen to you. We give you the information. You don't question us. But what ZAC forgets is that ZAC is employed by the taxpayers of Zimbabwe. So more than the CCC, there needs to be a citizens, I'm not a lawyer, but when citizens gather together and take something to court, like a class action lawsuit from citizens against ZAC, because ZAC is employed by the people of Zimbabwe to serve as an independent commission, and they completely failed at that job. Not putting ZAC to task in this election is going to perpetuate this behavior, because we can't run away from elections unless we are saying that we are satisfied with becoming a country where either elections are stolen and we go about our day, or we become a country where things happen with elections and some general decides that they're going to take over. Because those are the two options that Africa is left with. You either have, and there are three options, either you have good elections, or in the case of Zimbabwe, you have terrible elections and life moves on, or you have terrible elections and somebody coups, right? And we don't want those two options. So Zimbabwean citizens need to put together a class action lawsuit against ZAC because ZAC failed. In
the meantime, what is the likely process between now and the deadline by which court action should have been taken? What is your understanding, knowing that how close you are to 3Cs? What is the likely process from now, from today to next week? You have to warn.
I'm not that close to the 3Cs, right? People think that you should see the way that I get disciplined on Twitter. That will tell you that I'm not at all very close to power. Anyway, I think the opposition should have a plan. I mean, this is a party of lawyers. So if they fail to take anything to court, I'm going to be very disappointed in them, right? This is a party top to bottom full of lawyers. I'm not a lawyer, and I can see that they have a strong case to take to the courts. Whether or not the courts throw it out, again, the case is there. This is why what Xavier Kasukuwere did is critical, right? You take something to court, you give the courts the opportunity to do something wrong, and the courts did something wrong in the Xavier Kasukuwere case. It might not have been useful in this election, but that's something to come back to. We take the people to court like Elizabeth Valerio did, because how can an election commission say, we will not accept local currency, we will not accept this sort of payment? You take them to court. And so I hope that the team of lawyers is ready to do that. And I don't think there is a timeline really for a citizens action, lawsuit, whatever, against ZAC. I don't think there is a timeline for that. I don't think there is a precedence for that in Zimbabwe, but I don't think that should be impossible to do even after the particular deadline has passed, because the crimes of ZAC are very different, I think, to the crimes of the past.
I'll be coming back to you as we sum up after a long discussion that follows. Robert, what's to be done?
Great question, and great submissions from everyone. Let me go back. I don't think I answered the, what was odd and is it null and void? I'll touch on those very quickly. The biggest odd part was FAZ, FAZ. I know that Xavier Kasukuwere mentioned them. That was an odd one. I wrote, for me, it was, who are they serving? What was their purpose? And what was the impact that they made? I don't know if there's a way for that to be calculated, but I know that the other odd that their role made it from start to finish was a red flag of rigging in this election. Their presence, even during, I remember when I checked my voter registration and it showed that I was not in the database. When you actually go to physically verify, they were at the verification process, just standing there. So whether it was, some sort of intimidation in their presence, it made a difference. And you align that to the process of voting day. That was something that was very odd that we should have paid much attention to as a people. The other one that was odd in this election was the drastic increase in polarization and the drastic increase in misinformation in this election. It was big, very, very big, to the point that it caused voter exhaustion, where people didn't know where the correct information was coming from, who was right, and what policies or where they would vote. So it created a huge problem for voters in deciding what they were going to do towards the end. And that was a big one. Is the election null and void? It should be. It should be null and void. Is it going to be? I don't think so. I don't believe so. And I use this as examples when we look at like Uganda, and even earlier this year, we look at Nigeria that faced real violence. And we look at does SADC have teeth? Does the AU have teeth? What, can they come in and make a difference? What is their mandate? And does the Zimbabwean government have to listen to them? So what it comes down to is exactly what Chipo is referring to. It's the people. If there's any place that I would say we invest in, or that I am disappointed, is in our reaction as citizens of our country in what is done by a handful of folks, and our reaction towards that. One thing that we do miss, are missing in our society, is real political education on how to have dialogue about our politics. As a people, we're missing that. If we look at the folks that are leaving the country versus those that are staying, we're realizing that the human capital in Zimbabwe is leaving Zimbabwe. So the conversation is deteriorating around our politics and what it should be. So that's where we should really be focused on as we move forward. This comes now to your question now. What happens now? What do we do next? I don't think that much is going to change, as Dr. Chan had mentioned. However, there are some areas that are impacted in Zimbabwe as a whole that affects the result of this election. One of them is the debt arrears negotiation that was taking place, being led by former president in Mozambique. One of the key measures in that was the free and fair elections. and that has not been met. This is where the opportunity to come in and, forgive my language here, but I call it pressure for progress. There has to be pressure on the current government today or the new parliamentarians that come in that creates an interim government of some sort that brings a negotiation over the next 5 years for us to have economic development, for us to have social development, for us to have in regional and international dialogue for Zimbabwe to progress. These deals that are there, that exist, that were pre-election, may not progress forward, which takes Zimbabwe back. Even if we look at, you look at the Chinese and you look at their influence, particularly around BRICS, which is ironic that we were having an election and just across the border was the BRICS meeting taking place. A lot of the countries or entities that are doing business with Zimbabwe don't want to do it on an illegitimate election process. So an interim government needs to be put in place for us to have some sort of stability in how we start moving our economy forward and start looking at how we start putting certain measures in place. If it is debt renegotiation, it is an opportunity for those people that are negotiating that to say, no, there needs to be an interim government with progressive milestones between now and 2028, whether that is electoral reforms that allows the country to move forward. So I think my wish would be, and my goal would be, how do we get, if we're not going to have free and fair elections and this result is going to stand, whether the reports come out saying that it is null, it was shambolic, there are real measures in place that are in other corridors that can allow the conversation to come back to the table and say, how do we create a negotiated path forward for Zimbabwe? We saw this in Chimurenga. If we can have a negotiated path to stop a war, we should have a negotiated path in our country to ensure that there is progress and development in Zimbabwe for the next 5 years. We can't afford for it to be stagnant. So what I would like to see is a negotiated path forward that looks at an alliance, one that brings in things like our prosperity as a nation, our international trade development. How do we improve on reforms and processes? We can go to courts, we can put all these things in place, but if those systems are still inaccurate and don't have the right methods of improvement around them, we're just going to be spinning our wheels and we'll be right back here in 5 years. So my challenge is for those that have been elected with the result as MPs that go in, let's focus on the reforms right now from day one as we move forward. And let's work with the international community for Zimbabwe to move forward, to bring the right people to the table, have a coalition government and move forward in that to take the country forward for the people. But we have to educate our people when it comes to political dialogue in preparation for 2028.
Thanks, Robert. Before we table our proposal, which is more or less along the lines we just outlined, I would like to ask Xavier. I saw reactions already on Twitter to my proposal about the idea of mediation towards a comprehensive political settlement in Zimbabwe. Others like Matinyarara said, Mandasa is now pushing for government of national unity, and Chinamasa or someone purporting Chinamasa saying, no, there will be no GNU, we rule on our own. Now, what is this? Is this grandstanding? Is it a position being taken to strengthen their stance at the negotiation table? And most of all, do you think that Mnangagwa and his government, if they persist as they appear intent to, are likely to manage in the months and years ahead? Xavier.
Thank you very much. And I think I also want to thank my colleagues who have spoken. But in response directly to what you have raised, I think you have been very consistent from day one that we need to negotiate, we need a dialogue. And you will recall our last discussion with Pitnagap and others and Honorable Biti. Again, we made the submission that we should, as Zimbabweans, sit down. Why do I say that? I say that because whether we like it or not, as a nation that is at war with itself, the only resolution that can get us out of this situation is to bring all these contesting parties to a round table Doc, when myself and colleagues, Zambia and others, decided on me standing as an independent candidate, the idea was to bring a negotiated settlement. I did not mind what I was going to get, but as long as it was over 10%, I knew it was going to bring us on to a negotiated position. We're going to sit down. And this is the yearning by all Zimbabweans. There is no need to embarrass one another. What is required is for all of us to simply put the national interest ahead of self. We have a whole nation which is burning. We have people who are not happy. Even after this election, Harare resembles a funeral. I mean, you should be expecting celebrations, but people are not celebrating. There is nobody running up and down, making noise about their huge win, because it's an embarrassment. So basically what it means, in my view, we cannot avoid the table. It is imperative that we are able as Zimbabweans to sit down, and this is supported by one of your submissions, where you talk about eminent person group. Certainly, after this report by SADC, it's imperative that I think the Troika and SADC should second eminent persons to assist Zimbabweans to resolve these issues. Why do I say that? I say that because we can go another 5 years with Emerson in charge by himself saying, I'll do what I want. But our discussions with the world in terms of debt rescheduling, there'll be no movement. And what does it mean to the health institutions in our country, which Hopewell always talks about? What does it mean to our education? Poverty. Our people are suffering. We need now to put the national interest ahead of self. I also believe that the report by the region was so important, because this report is just not about the observations on the elections or what happened. I have a feeling that it is also a summation of their deep-seated frustration with Zimbabwe's inability to resolve their issues. We have been given almost a space of over 20 years to try and come together. The GNU was one of those areas. The SADC has always stood behind the people of Zimbabwe to protect us, to ensure that we can at least find each other. But it appears wisdom is lacking. It appears we are not prepared to subordinate ourselves to the greater interests of our people. And this is where I think the region must come hard on us to make sure that there is a table. Those who are outside the country must come back into the country. Those who have issues, I think it would be nice for Mnangagwa to end his leadership at some point of our country and say, you know what, guys, I brought everybody together. There were humps and there were bumps along the way, but this is the best that I did. Doc, as I sit here, 52 people, if not more, have lost their lives here in Joburg. And I'm told a huge majority of them are Zimbabweans. Our people are dying. Our people are suffering. And yet as leaders, one is eyeing riches at the expense of the betterment of our people. Yes, there are arrogant characters in our system. I mean, it's clear that the judiciary is headed by a very hard-headed man, Justice Malawa, and the same with Mnangagwa. But these guys must understand they have responsibilities that are greater than their individual interests. They must allow the judiciary to work as a judiciary. Everybody must be free to approach the courts and get fairness. As well as those political parties that are going there, they must also be expected to get a fair hearing. But put that aside, I believe the most important issue here is we've endangered our people, we've left our people exposed, we want to bring back the international community to work with us, we want to be a respected member of SADC, we want to make a contribution to SADC. We are now a cancer that is affecting the entire region. Our problems have spilled beyond our borders. Zimbabwean issues are now domestic issues in many countries. Murders, theft, and so forth. It is now part of the domestic crime scenes in various other countries. So we need to really be leaders. And I think if we can, if I was Mnangagwa, I was going to say, okay, let me pick up my call. Nelson, come here. I know Tyson is making noise. Come here. Everybody, come here. Let's have a discussion. What do we do about our country? You lose nothing. If anything, you'll gain the country. But to be arrogant and say, yeah, because I have 52%, which you know you can get, and then say, yeah, because I have 52%, I'll do what I want. The world is watching us. We're humiliating ourselves. We should just go beyond this selfish interest, selfish altruism. Let's put our country ahead of the individual interest. Let's subordinate ourselves. Let's go on the table. Get the world to support us. If we fix our politics, the rest will follow. It is our politics which is wrong. You can engage the EUs, you can engage everybody else, but for as long as there is noise in the cockpit, nobody takes you seriously. So we were saying to President Chisano, look, you're an elder statesman, don't take sides. Come back to Harare, hear every side. Sit down with the Mnangagwa, sit down with the Chiwenga, sit down with those who are in the disagreement and say, guys, we're all Zimbabweans at the end of the day. What can we do to get you out of where you are? Other countries have gone through these difficulties.
Let's stop there and move into the very topic that you have raised, which is the idea of a transitional government.
Yeah.
What possibilities? Stephen has already indicated that it's a hard sell. We know better. Those of us who have been pushing this since 2016, when we thought that would preempt the conditions which normally NTAs are premised upon, which is bloodshed. We failed. 2017, there was a coup. And since the coup, there's been no improvement, neither politically nor economically. We are near the precipice economically. And here we are. So we thought, in the circumstances, we'd put, for the 10th time, the proposed transitional government proposal as a petition to SADC through the organ on politics, defense, and security, and the AU, and indeed to the international community, and that this be a citizens' movement. We don't know how far we did this a year and a half ago. We did a petition for Job Sikala. We have some almost 60,000 signatures. We don't know how much it will get, because it's not just Zimbabweans, but it's also the region, Africa, and the diaspora, the proposal. I don't know if Tony is able to put that page on the screen, but I may outline its main elements. There are three main elements. One is to confirm, the first is to confirm that indeed the elections were a sham.
Yeah.
They lack credibility. You can put it on the page on the screen, and therefore,
Dave, can I share my screen?
Yeah, just put it on. There's no unanimity among all the observer missions, with varying degrees of observations, that the elections lack credibility. We have gone further in this page to say, in our view, the elections are null and void. And if so, on the first point, does it mean that there will be no parliament sitting? That there will be no president sworn in? That's the first. The second is that we have outlined the objectives of transitional government, that in the absence of a parliament, the absence of a government, the transitional authority must become the executive. In the circumstances of Zimbabwe, we're proposing that this be a kind of a coalition, as opposed to GNU. A GNU, as we have had the experience before, was a GNU between two parties, ZANU-PF and MDC. We are saying, we are proposing, without much details in this document, that the transitional government we're talking about would necessarily have to have ZANU-PF and CCC as the main elements, but we are suggesting that there must be a third element, which is civic society, the smaller parties, the intellectuals, the business diaspora. Having said that, I need to make what do you call it? An expression of a disclosure that those of us who have been pushing this transitional government idea, we have stated before and we stated again, we are not interested in being part of it. We want to be simply facilitators. And therefore, the proposal we're making here is that we have ZANU-PF and SAPES 1/3 each, and a third of the government being the totality of civic society as a kind of mediation agency, so to speak. But most important of all, it is the reform agenda with which the transitional government should be seized with. And we've outlined that in the document. On the political front, they need to restore constitutionalism in Zimbabwe, the rule of law, cure the coup. They need to reform and restore national institutions. They need to ensure separation of powers, an accountable executive, a vibrant legislature when we get to that, and a fiercely independent judiciary. There's need to reform these institutions, no doubt about that. And to embark on a comprehensive reform agenda, which means that when we have the elections next time, the elections will be held under conditions conducive to a free, fair, and credible election, as is the position in neighboring countries. We need to put aside this reputation, which is not unjustified, reputation of being a country which has rigged elections systematically. We need to throw that aside. And the only way to do it is through a reform agenda. On the economic front, the idea to attend to our economic situation, to ensure that there's economic recovery through a careful monitoring of the receipts from our exports, especially minerals. They need to stem corruption. They need to ensure that our proceeds from exports are invested as they are in other countries towards infrastructure and, more important, towards social development, education, and health. I see Fei Chung on the screen. She knows what we did in 1980, the amount of work we did to put into education and health. And now, 40 years afterwards, education and health are in tatters. We need to restore that. And we do have the capacity to do that. We need to establish a sovereign fund. We need to establish a recovery plan to which our friends abroad can invest into, but in which also we can begin the system of repatriating the loot out there back into the country and make our country as great a country as before. And indeed, to attend to the diaspora, we have over 6 million people outside the country, and we need to get them home. They are contributing immensely, almost $2 billion a year in remittances, but we need them home. A scenario where 75% of all professional people outside the country is a very sad situation. It must be reversed, and we can make Zimbabwe a great country. And so we are proposing, as we do in the document, that eminent persons be appointed, whose task would be to consult with Zimbabweans, the two major parties, but also the small parties, civic society, and come to some arrangement and a definition of a transitional government, which is at once inclusive, but also capacitated in terms of human resources and expertise to move our country forward. And we have already moved, as my article in the Sunday Times, many of you have read it, we have been in touch with the DECO in South Africa, the Ministry of International Relations, since January. And we had proposed an international conference at which these proposals were put on the table, and at the end of which eminent persons would be appointed. And I can mention that the proposed persons were Kaliwa Motlanthe in South Africa, Obasanjo in Nigeria or West Africa, and Jakaya Kikwete in Tanzania, and possibly Mr. Uhuru from Kenya. The idea was to go beyond the region, but ensure that it is an African-driven affair, and that we thought that with over 3 months, we should be able to get to a point where we have an international conference in Zimbabwe that will bring us to at least the beginning of resolving the Zimbabwe question, and establish and conclude a genuine political and economic settlement in Zimbabwe. So the document is there. Can you put it out? We will be distributing this document, but we thought we should have sight of it. Tony?
I need to share my screen.
Yes.
David?
In the meantime, we can begin discussing this. Maybe to begin with Stephen. On the basis of my outline, we can begin discussing this. And the idea really is to flag this petition far and wide while we engage civic society and indeed engage have the SADC organ receive our petition and help us on the way forward. Got a problem, Tony?
I think you have to let me in. Somebody has to let me in so I can share.
Could you please share the link in the chat as well for the proposal?
Yeah, the link is in the chat box. If you look at it, if you look up the top there, there's a chat box. You'll see the link, but I can give you the bullet points if I can share my screen.
Well, what's
David,
happening to
can I share my screen, please?
Oh, David is gone.
Oh, okay.
Dr. Mandaza, I think you are the host right now, so you might have to give Tony the. I think I saw that pop up earlier. I think you're the host.
Okay, hold on.
Yeah, we can just switch off. Well, they said they're going to show the document. But well, let's wait and see how long they take.
Yeah, Ibo's the host, I'm afraid. Okay.
Please, please share the link for the document.
Yeah, the link's in the document. Okay.
And then continue. I mean, you flash the document for a minute or two. No, just send the link. People will follow up on it later.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, the link is there. I think the link is there. The link is there. If you go up, scroll up on the chat, you'll see the link. I'm sorry, I don't seem to be able to do the co-hosting. Ibo, if you make me co-host, I can do that. But maybe people can just comment on the points you've made.
Dr. Mandaza, the link is there and the document is already popped through.
Tony, Tony, you're co-host. Can you try and put the document there? If you can't, then we'll simply discuss the main elements of the proposal.
Yeah, you just have to discuss your points. I can't do it. If you can't share my screen, then
Yeah,
I
but
can. Hang on a second.
You are co-host now.
Hang on. Okay, they're the major points. Okay.
Okay, there you are. The establishment of an eminent persons group tasked with negotiating the establishment of a transitional government composed of political parties and other major citizen groupings. 2, the negotiations must be broad-based, including political parties, civil society, churches, labor, women, and other citizen groupings. The transitional government should set up with a clear and specific set of reforms that must be achieved, which should include the following: the resolution of the coup and the amendment to the constitution allowing untrammeled military interference in civilian affairs. The reference to that, for those who don't know the Zimbabwe scene, in 2017, after the coup, there was a judgment by Justice Chiweshe, which ipso facto said that the military was entitled to interfere or to intervene in political affairs. So we have de facto a military government, if I may put it in those terms. Thirdly, full adherence to constitutionalism, the rule of law and human rights, the reform of critical state institutions, the stabilizing of the economy with a pro-poor emphasis, the establishment of a sovereign fund to ensure the country benefits from Zimbabwe's bountiful resources. Move the page, Tony.
I can't. Something's gone wrong. I'm sorry, people. You've got a techie here who just doesn't know what he's doing.
Uncle, people, please add to the statement people with disabilities.
Great, we'll take note of that.
Thank you.
Take note of... Tony, can you read the rest of the document then? Are you hearing me, Tony?
I am.
Read the rest of the document.
Yeah. Where's your document? I've got the document. Sorry, something's gone wrong.
Read the document. Anyway, so that's the main elements of the document.
I don't know what's going on. I don't need panels.
Do people here on this platform agree with the broad elements of this document? Let me start with Stephen Chan.
Well, yes, of course, the broad elements of this document is very, very aspirational. There's a very great deal of common sense and a very great deal of citizen sense embedded in it. I do maintain my position that it's unlikely to get very much traction, certainly on the part of the Mnangagwa government, and persuading surrounding states to take it as a blueprint for the future, that'll be very hard to do. Now, having said that, the eminent persons that you suggested, they do still have a lot of clout. I wonder, however, whether they would want to be involved in this. Someone like Obasanjo, for instance, is very, very busy right now, and we have to take time out from his other activities. And whether or not he would have clout with the current government, because he and ZANU-PF have had arguments before, of course. What you've got is trying to find people who would be trusted by both sides as both eminent and as being able to negotiate or help negotiate a way forward. All of the basic aspirational ideals of the document are, of course, absolutely wonderful. But as I say, in the world of gaining political traction, that might be very, very difficult. And if you don't get the most eminent of African statesmen, statespeople to try to help you, and then you won't get any traction at all. So I'm very much supportive, but I'm also quite skeptical, I have to say.
Thanks, Stephen. Chipo?
So the first thing is, I am very concerned about having unelected people in government with so much power. If there was to be something like this, I think the unelected people have to be chosen in some quarter of some sort by people from political parties. I mean, that's my biggest concern. You know, I think governance need people that are elected, that are accountable to the people. That 1/3 of eminent people, to whom are they accountable? Even though political parties are pretty problematic, they're still in some way accountable to the people that vote for them. So having 1/3 of government that's just people that are there because, you know, they have PhDs or how do we even, you know, decide who they haven't campaigned, they haven't, I don't know. Generally, I just think.
So what are you proposing? You propose that we have a rerun of the election? The import of a transitional government is precisely the word transitional. Transitional towards a situation where there can be free, fair, and credible elections. That's what a transitional. We need a body, transitional body. It's not the first transitional body, by the way. We've had that. We had CODESA in South Africa. We had the abortive one in Sudan, which incidentally borrowed from us, from our discussion on the transitional authority. So the word transitional refers to it and is intended to solve a situation in which we find ourselves, unless you are suggesting that there must be a rerun of elections under the same conditions.
You know what? I will continue to think about this. But also thank you for all of your hard work. I definitely have to continue thinking about in what ways I see it working in my own framing. Thank you.
No, fine, you can come back to it. Robert? Robert?
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you. Yeah, so I was actually looking at the petition. I believe this is a step forward. Dr. Chen and Chipo are both correct in the buy-in. You know, one of the things I put in here is their buy-in for essentially shared power. You know, and that's on both sides. You know, you could find that leaders might be, but the people, do they understand it? Does it make sense to them? You know, what does it mean? Is there direct buy-in? The other side of that is the impact to beneficiaries of the current situation who may oppose this with great resources. There are people who benefit from the way things are right now and the continued deterioration, which increases the gap between the people and them. What is the impact of that, and do we have enough support to combat that, both in the country domestically and regionally? There are people that benefit from. There are people that are benefiting heavily from the corrupt government, and being able to have shared power and reforms means that they get to lose their grip, or they themselves find themselves in a pretty big jam. And that's some pretty nasty geopolitics that we would enter and make into. The third one is the protections of the agreement. You know, are there protections around this agreement that if it was entered, individuals in there, we would not find ourselves back where we are now, maybe 10, 15 years from now. So I agree that we need to have that. Even during the GNU in Zimbabwe, while I have my own assertions of the failures of opportunity that could have led us in a different path, particularly where opposition dominated and had majority in parliament, you know, we saw that quickly change out and transition out. And we saw that during the GNU, because there were other sets of eyes that had certain levels of visibility that were there, the country did improve. So my thoughts would be starting in places that are best for the country, and that being the focal negotiation point to turn the hands to bring people to the table. Because unfortunately, when we're failing to do that with an election, I believed, and I still believe, that it is necessary to have a third political outfit that is strong. We've just seen this in Spain, where an opposition when no one got majority because there was a third option. When we stay binary with two political parties, it's a win or lose situation, and we end up with arguments and contestation. While legitimate, in this case here in Zimbabwe, a complete sham of this election and complete chaos, we have seen success in having the third strong option, which our people don't seem to understand is very relevant. We've seen that in Germany when it came to the CDU and how they quickly came from a third option and really made plays where now that's the chancellor. Spain, as I mentioned, we saw that earlier this year as well, but that makes a big difference. So I believe right now to bring people to the table and have conversations that are not really politically based, but really about progress and prosperity for the country, there's something to look at when it comes to renegotiating arrears debt, looking at development process for Zimbabwe, looking at our international trade, and then looking at economic development when it comes to infrastructure in the country, which bypasses the region and brings other players to the table that might already have their hands in the cookie jar, but it becomes a little bit more friendlier conversation and how to navigate the country forward for the people. That's my thoughts. I do agree that we need to have a coalition government, and I would add to it that possibly even a suspension of elections. I think the Zimbabwe Churches Council they had a different term for it, but we've seen this work in Singapore. We've even seen it work in some countries that needed to skip leaps and bounds of development to get the country forward. 5 years would be too short. I would say that we focus on maybe a 10-year hiatus in this coalition government so the country really can put the real reforms and economic processes in place and then set the stage for an election timeframe a little bit further down the road. That's my thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Before I turn to the floor, Xavier?
Oh, no, I think I agree, Dr. Mandaza, with the suggestions that you have made. So to say that perhaps the very important bullet where you talk about negotiations, broad-based, I think one of the key things that could be done right now is to start engaging the churches in our country, the civil society, labor, if there's still a labor movement to talk about, because I think it's critical that this idea carry the majority of our people and groups that have interplay with the people on a day-to-day basis. But otherwise, I think it's a brilliant idea to say, let's sit down as Zimbabweans and find each other. I think nothing beats that. If anybody wants something outside that, then I don't know what they want. But I think this is a very good idea. It's a beginning. Let's work on it and build on it.
Thank you. Let's have Tafadzwa, Charles, and then Jana. Tafadzwa, then Godfrey Mutindi.
Yes, thank you. This is Tafadzwa Munjanja. I'm speaking here from the United States. I think, Dr. Mandaza, your document kind of leads us into the direction where we need to go in terms of negotiations and dialogue. I think that the leaders of our country, from a very fundamental, very basic background, they need to talk. They need to sit at a table and discuss the way forward for our country. And the people who need to be on the table are people from the residue of this flawed election. We don't want to call them winners. These are not winners because the election was flawed. But we have a residue of votes that came in from a flawed election, and they need to talk. CCC, ZANU-PF, they need to find a way to talk to each other. At the end of the day, they need to think about us, the citizens of Zimbabwe. We are stuck in a political stalemate where we don't have economic opportunities, social opportunities. Our lives are put on pause because of egos between two parties with different ideologies, although fundamentally with the basic heritage in terms of Africanness and Ubuntu. So that Ubuntu has to unite our leaders. Emerson Mnangagwa, Tevya Kasukuere, Nelson Chamisa, Mr. Chapman, all these leaders, they need to talk. That's my suggestion. So I think a transitional authority may complicate how things work, but I do think that a coalition is a good option going forward, because a coalition is where leaders recognize that they do have influence in the country, and they agree to share some levels of power to govern, to open up the country, to reduce the tension. And who are those people? The people with the residue from this flawed election. Emerson Mnangagwa, Nelson Chamisa. Let them share power from that residue. Let them talk. The other political leaders, social leaders, the religious leaders. So I think from a very basic, fundamental, non-complicated scenario, we just need people to talk. However the nature of that government becomes, transitional, GNU or coalition, we can cross that line, but we need our leaders to talk and to de-escalate the tension in the country. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Father. So just one clarification for you. What we are talking about is the transitional government made up of a coalition of the various forces or factors that you have mentioned. It's a transitional because it is not, it is transition to another stage in the absence of elected persons, given the election is flawed. But recognizing the reality that exists, namely there's ZANU-PF, there's CCC, there are smaller parties, Chapman and others, and that these could constitute the transitional government. That's really the point I would make. Let's move on to...
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Tafadzwa. Thank you very much. Charles? Charles?
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Mandaza. Thank you so much, the panelists who were presenting. I'm Charles. I'm talking from UK. I feel like what you're talking, or else your propositions, Dr. Mandaza and team, are very important and are very factual, or else they further the interests of the people. But in all these discussions, I've got one main problem, which I feel like as much as you're proposing all these, without navigating through that question, or else without answering to that question, a lot of these dialogues, a lot of these discussions, but they will end up not materializing or else coming up into fruition. One thing I'm asking for is for us to say we are going for a dialogue or else people are going for a dialogue. My question is, what initiatives which can be there to take these people or else to remove the egos they have or calling them to the table? Because what I've discovered is that we had some of these discussions way back when I was in Zimbabwe. I attended SAPES Trust physically before COVID. This discussion could come out, but the thing is, we have different political players with different, they can say it's ideologies, but what I can feel is they've got different agendas. The thing is, do these political players have people at heart? If they don't have people at heart, you are going to come to a situation whereby, yes, you have proposed this, but ZANU-PF may say, no, we don't want this. We won, we got our thing, we'll rule on our own. Whether people suffer, people do what, they will just say, there's no problem as long as we are taking our 5 years. For me, the question which always comes into my mind is, are there no other initiatives which can be taken to take these people to the table? Because it's very difficult. Yes, you can go through these elders and so on, but what if they just refuse to come on the table and they say we have won the election? What's next?
We have to try.
Thank you so
Charles.
much.
Try, yes. Thanks a lot. We have to try, and that's the reason why we and the eminent persons we have referred to are important as facilitators. They have to come and speak to everybody. Civic society in its variety, in its diversity, has to organize itself for that occasion. And so we are saying that as Zimbabweans, we are not able to navigate and mediate among ourselves. So we need some people from outside to assist us. That's really the point. Yana?
Thank you, Prof. And thanks everybody for the input. It was a really interesting dialogue to listen to. I like the proposal, the idea of convening Zimbabweans and different political actors together. I think, Prof, you know, we can learn from the initial initiative of the proposal of a transitional government that you led actually a couple of years ago. The question around the political appetite for ZANU-PF and CCC to be open to this idea, for me, I think that's the biggest question mark to be tinkered at. My calculation is that this is not politically attractive to either CCC or ZANU-PF, and their openness towards it, which I think you would need for it to be a successful initiative, is highly questionable. And so I want to make a different proposal, and perhaps there could be another discussion with a smaller group to tinker at this. That, yes, there still ought to be, and I agree with that, I love it, the convening of eminent persons who can help Zimbabwe find a political way forward without naming and articulating the specificity of a transitional government, is what I would propose, because then you open up options that can be tinkered to suit our specific context in Zimbabwe at the moment. I think the transitional governments I have looked at are the ones that are mostly in post-conflict countries, and so though that context tends to be bearing for it to be absorbed even by the population and political actors and so forth and so on. So that's one thing I would propose that we think about. In terms of the who, I have also other ideas. Again, as I said, I'm happy to participate in some follow-up questions. I have issues with Obasanjo for different reasons, but I agree with Dr. Chan. He's right now fully, his head is on the horn. He's still got the Ethiopias and whatnot to deal with. Ethiopia is re-erupting at the moment, and he's been spending a lot of time in that region. I like the idea of expanding it beyond just the political actors in terms of a conversation. I think with different people have talked about a dialogue, and I think somewhere in here there's a sweet spot. But yeah, I think what you would find polarizing for most political actors is the specificity of naming transitional government. And for purposes of getting traction for the idea, I would argue that let's tone the terminology. And then the question of mandate, it might be interesting if we do a citizen's request to these eminent leaders, so that you are not putting the AUs and the SADCs and others into a place where they might say no if you ask them to mandate pulling together such a body, because it's highly possible because of your political dynamics in these regional organizations that are member state led. So the question is, could we do a citizens ask, find our own processes of helping the convening of this body, and they come because the Zimbabwean citizenry has asked them to help our country at such a time as this, and we see how that goes. That's another proposal I wanted to put. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jana. On your last point, the problem has always been the question of agency in how to get civil society to organize itself, to make itself coherent enough to put a position. But I think in our case, we have a reality which you cannot avoid. We have ZANU-PF there, and we have CCC there as organs, structures, so to speak. You can't avoid them. But we are thinking more of a Lancaster type. Some of us were at Lancaster as backroom boys at the time, and is that which is informing our proposal. I agree with you entirely that we don't want to be definitive at all as to the composition, except what I've just said already. But we thought we should put on the table immediately what this transitional government should be charged with, namely political and economic reforms. We lost the opportunity at the GNU. Nothing happened on the 5 years of it, because there was no agenda. It was just a unity government between two parties who shared power but not shared equally, and was too short-lived. 4 years not enough. So we want to be more, and we hope that as the idea develops, is to have even more details as to how power is shared, the issues of amnesty. We have a bigger document, by the way, but we thought at this stage is just to flag the broad outline. But we take your comments, and I hope that when it comes to discussing the main details, that people like Jana will be there. Rekai? Rekai from the US? Welcome.
Thank you so much, Prof. So I think this is a very good idea. I think what you've done is a step in the right direction. And I would say that for me, from where I'm sitting, I don't think the proposition can be sustained that the people that we have in power right now were not elected. I know there is a possibility that they were not elected, but in the absence of V11s, you cannot sustain that. So I think it's a good idea for there to be this kind of a transitional government or arrangement that will take care of electoral reforms amongst other things. And I think one important thing would be the language that is going to be used in the petition. I know there's already one, but just to highlight this, that we need to know, I think, the position of most of those who are in SADC, or their historical position, if I can say that. I think it needs to be clear that there is also one important thing in respect of which some of these former liberation movements are lacking, that the call for electoral reforms, or for reforms broadly, or in the context of Zimbabwe, when people are calling for electoral reforms, it's not like they are saying they are calling for the removal of ZANU-PF from power, because I have heard some sentiments suggesting that that is what electoral reforms are all about in the context of Zimbabwe. It should be understood that I think these reforms are intended to ensure that elections become genuinely competitive to such an extent that they will put pressure on whichever party would be in power to deliver. And I think perceived that way, it means electoral reforms are actually going to help in the fulfillment of the aspirations of the liberation struggles. Because I have heard these counter arguments to say, we went to war, we liberated these countries. That's well and good. I think that's true. But then after liberating the countries, what exactly has happened in these countries? And I think it's there for all to see that Zimbabwe has not fared well, ZANU-PF has not fared well to date. If we look historically and the state of Zimbabwe today, where we are today. So I think we need to convince these people at the SADC level to not to neglect this other important part where these former liberation movements now need to deliver in line with the aspirations of the people to fulfill those aspirations that were the basis for the fighting of the liberation struggle. And I think in terms of the specifics, I would like to ask that if it gets to a point where specific proposals are required, one thing that I think would be worth proposing to SADC is that they endorse the conduct of parallel vote tabulation in elections. If they want, they can test this in a number of other elections in the region before they can endorse it. And then they mandate the conduct of a PVT so that it helps not only in instilling transparency in electoral processes, but with the much needed acceptance of results by the loser. That is important for democracy, and that SADC and the AU care about. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll take the last one, Godfrey Mutindi. Then I'll go back to our panelists to wind up. Mutindi.
Hello, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Could you try again?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I would not want to repeat or re-emphasize the issues which have already been touched. The issue of the complicitness of some of the African leaders who have been flighted here. Some of them have been entangled in the Zimbabwean political developments from the time Zimbabwe was suspended from the Commonwealth, things like that. They are mentioned, not necessarily that they will be partial, but then their mention will automatically start the old confrontations. That's one of the things. The second thing is that we know the terrain, the Zimbabwean terrain very well. There is polarization. And in a polarized situation in which we are, identifying who is civil society, who is an opposition party, who is a major party, or who is a minor party might take us a lot of time. So I'm just highlighting some of those issues because you find out that civil society, there are very few organizations, if any, which are standing with the people. There is very little a space of that one. It's either they are there or they are there. They have got the head of civil society, but actually they are politicians, partisan politicians for that matter. So that's one of the issues that we have to contend with. And within the issue, within the context of polarization, somebody has mentioned the issue of the GNU. The GNU should have been a building block for continuous dialogue, for reviews, for the political parties and the political players to discuss and to exchange ideas as we are going on. But the challenge we have in Zimbabwe is that the binary situation, it's either ZANU-PF wants to sink the MDC or the CCC as it is now called, or the CCC MDC wants to sink ZANU-PF. There are very few, there is very little space for collaboration for Zimbabwe. That's one of the critical areas that we have to establish and to encourage that. No, besides these political heads, we are Zimbabweans, and there is no shop that sells to either party or the other one. There is no infrastructure for the other party. It's either we sink together or we live together. So these are some of these few points I wanted to highlight only. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much indeed. Now we turn to the panel. Chipo, your last words. I want also to say, as you finalize, Chipo and the other panelists, is to look at the document and see what else can be added to the document. And if you can't do it now, certainly later on, so that we strengthen the document. Robert Chapman has already sent me a note, which I hope that you elaborate.
If someone can go ahead of me, I just have a little crisis with the child.
Yeah, okay, fine. I'll go to Robert then. Robert.
Yes, sir. Yeah. So, in my closing remarks,
I was just sending a message to say, please include these suggestions you are making as those that should be included in the document. I think they're very cogent. So I'll leave that to make the point.
Yeah, thank you very much. And there are many ways for us to skin this cat, which the goal is we want to get to a point where we have progress in our country. We want Zimbabwe to progress. We want to stop we're staying these political election cycles, through the entire 5 years, and we wonder why our people are exhausted. On the ground, economically, nothing is moving forward. There's a lot of optimism in the idea. The execution of it is where the concern comes in for a lot of people. How do people come back to the table? And there are many opportunities to negotiate this. I keep going back to the economic challenges that Zimbabwe faces. One is the ability to borrow funds right now because of the debt arrears that exists, and renegotiating that. Of course, that has now failed, which is the Chisano agreement. That's failed now because of the results of these elections. But the opportunity for a coalition as a smart leader that would be looking to grow their country would be one to say, yes, we're open to, Mnangagwa will come in and say we were open to a coalition government or a transitional government in these next 5 years, or whatever time frame that is in this agreement. And the part of that is we want to set milestones in place for sanction removal as a coalition being part of that. You will find the opportunities for the international community and regional bodies to be very open to supporting Zimbabwe in a progressive approach. But it requires the thoughtful leaders, as Honorable Kasukuru was saying, that we don't have the wisdom in the leadership that exists today. It doesn't exist. So right now, saying that we see that this election is being challenged everywhere. The SADC body has spoken up against it. Many other observers, even the fact that people like Zesny and ERC were raided and arrested, for me would have been a sign that there might have been a parallel voter tabulation going on there, and they didn't want that to get out. And so they were raided as a result to prevent that from happening. The opportunity now exists to have negotiation. We failed to have a transitional government due to the delimitation report, which was challenged and also taken to court. That didn't happen. Now, with these results and the impact it will have on the people of Zimbabwe, creating a pressure cooker scenario for the citizens is very dangerous for our country, creates problems with our international trade. So there's an opportunity for leadership and leaders in our country to come together, look at the removal of sanctions as a part of negotiation, going through a coalition government and putting in milestones in place for those to be relaxed. The ability to look at our arrears debt and making sure that Zimbabwe has the ability now to borrow for infrastructure development and not give away or sell our minerals and natural resources through the back door in order to get some revenue in. Fighting corruption, judicial process, and all these things can be part of the negotiation and milestones to take place. So the question is, do the people of our country understand this instead of leaving this in the hands of people? I believe, Doc, that we have an education process. There's a gap. I heard Dr. Kosana Moyo say this one time in an interview, that there is a gap with our citizens in the way they understand political dialogue and what it means for our country to progress. There has to be an element of educating the citizens in how we should be having these conversations. However, I believe that the opportunity to have a progressive conversation that starts removing the shackles on Zimbabwe can happen through a coalition dialogue.
Thanks, Robert. Xavier, penultimate, your last words.
Thank you very much. I think the stage has been set. I see Zimbabweans and our friends all over the world coming together, agreeing that it's essential that some form of discussions are held. I think Dr. Nere and others have posited various views of how this, and Jana also did say the same, that how we're going to name this and how it's going to be put together could be something that can be worked on. Two things I would implore you, Dr. Mandaza, to now engage. You've taken the leadership anyway. Engage beyond us, the churches. I want to specifically say the churches in Zimbabwe, civil society, and others that you can meet. There are so many elders, I think, who are also interested to see our country come out of this situation. Then, secondly, we need now to follow the process. I'm informed, obviously, that the CCC will be going to court. They'll go to court. We await the outcome of those discussions, of that challenge. We all have doubts with our judiciary. Perhaps it might surprise us if they come with a different answer this time around. But even if they win or they don't succeed, the next step is obviously SADC. The Troika have done their report. The observer mission has done its report, which must be handed over to the Troika chairperson, and calling a summit of SADC to look at these things. And I think let's keep the pressure so that we can bring everybody on board. As these processes are proceeding, you and the other key players in our society should also be moving forward. But I think I have no doubt that we're having a meeting of the minds. We need to rescue our country. It's not going to be something that we must leave just a few people. It's our duty together, and failure is not an option. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Xavier. Chipo, are you ready?
I am, okay. And as others have said, I think this is an opportune time to try multiple strategies to get Zimbabwe out of this quagmire. Obviously, the best solution or the most likely solution is going to be some transitional agreement type government while we figure out the next 5 years. I think that, you know, the citizens in Zimbabwe, they're smart, they understand politics, but they're also people who've been left very disappointed. I think most people are afraid about a rerun because then they have memories from 2008, or a new election because they have memories from 2008. But people want to see a positive change in Zim. So the political actors, particularly the CCC, I think they have an upper hand internationally. I think the people that we've been sort of thinking about as eminent leaders, who I think are community leaders, should also lend their voices to the argument that we need something. So not just people like yourself who've been speaking for many years, but other actors who haven't been, you know, in the public space. It's the time for Zimbabweans to take SADC and AU to task and say, look, you guys, you say you are committed to democracy, you are committed to Zimbabwe doing well, and here is the opportunity to support us as we do that. I'm excited to hear that the CCC is going to the court again, not because this will result in a turnover of the election or any change, but again, you know, to lay their case bare, because even if you're going to have a transitional government, there needs to be legitimate reason, and the evidence that the CCC will present in court will support the mission you've put forward, will support anything that is pro-democracy, requires for the opposition and citizens to lay bare the injustices that happened with this election. Thank you very much.
Stephen, your last word. Stephen. Is Stephen gone? Stephen, feel free to come in as you wish while I'm summing up or trying to sum up. I think 3 things I have to say in summing up. The first is that really there is agreement that the elections were flawed, lack credibility, that in another country, in another universe, there would be a rerun. But a rerun is impossible, or is not realistic without reform as a precedent, as a prerequisite. Yes, the elections are null and void, we said ourselves, but as Stephen has warned us, is not the language of diplomacy, and we're likely to see fooling around. But all I want to say that basically, in general, the elections of 2008 were deemed likewise null and void, except that there was a parliament. And the parliament became the basis for the unity government between the two. And the question, therefore, for us, and I think Rekai has made the point, that we are likely to meet a stone wall in insisting that there was no election at all of MPs. They've been celebrating already on both sides of the bench, of the aisle rather. And you know, in this country, as in many other countries, livelihoods depend on this. The difference between being unemployed and being an MP is big. So it's likely that there'll be immense pressure from the parliamentarians to ensure that, notwithstanding whatever we might do, however flawed the elections were, they want to regard their election as real. And therefore, the question arises as to what is the import of the CCC's argument that they're going to court. Would that result in a rerun? would that resolve anything? Is there any precedent towards that? And this is why we thought the idea of a transitional government might be the solution, or rather the opportunity through which to one acknowledge that the election was not perfect at all, that in many respects null and void, but life must go on, and we must use the opportunity to put in place a process, a transition through which there will be reforms before the next election. We understood very clearly the enormous political obstacles in the face of this proposal. I want to say this, we have been hearing already, there are talks about talks. We have been in touch, or people have been in touch with us. There is in the background talk about the GNU. And what we are saying basically is to ensure that whatever emerges approximates more or less what we are discussing here, in particular, the idea of a reform agenda. We think as citizens, as intellectuals, as persons who have been engaged in the Zimbabwean political process, we should not lose the opportunity to deal with the fundamentals, the issues, the causes of our malaise in this country on the political and economic front. The GNU glossed over it. And we can't afford that again for the sake of our younger generation. Lastly, we agree with this discussion has been very important. It made us realize how incomplete our document is. But as I said earlier, the idea was to flag it broadly and then feed into it on the basis of consultation with all of you. We will be sending this out and putting it on Facebook in the hope that we get inputs from across. And when the document is ready, we want to send it out as a petition broadly. So simple question, is the transitional government the way to go forward? And we take it from there. And in that way, we are hoping to have citizens' subscription, involvement, and thereby constitute a viable body of opinion as we deal with the two political parties, who will be, of course, the major factors in any agreement that as we go forward. So on that note, I will say that thank everybody for coming on board, and we are sorry that inadvertently Zoom put a limit. Our limit is only 500. They put a limit of 100. I don't know why and how, but that happened. And likewise, there's been nothing on Facebook for the first time. I want to add that we have had enormous problems with Zoom. We had even more problems when we had physical meetings at SAPES, disruption by state agents, and we're ruling out interference with our Zooms now. But all the same, we think this is one of the best sessions we've had. We have had among the best of political actors in Zimbabwe, but also fine minds. And Stephen Chan, is always a pleasure to have you. And Chipo, thank you. So please write in and help us navigate this petition as a form of lobby for a better Zimbabwe tomorrow. We will not say we'll succeed, but let's keep trying. Thank you very much.